I would like to shed light in this lecture on the phenomenon of killings and plunder of Jews by local people in German-occupied Europe, crimes that occurred on the periphery of the Holocaust. In terms of numbers of Jewish victims, this was only a small fraction of the total killed by the Nazis. The loot that remained in local hands, not equally insignificant primarily because of the housing stock which was taken over by local residents, was also only a tiny part of the Jewish wealth that had been plundered during World War II. But as mysteries pertaining to the Holocaust abound, these marginal phenomena, adversarial interactions between Jews and their fellow citizens in occupied societies, had been catapulted decades later into the center of preoccupation for national historiographies. To address this subject, one needs to contend with yet another sort of marginality, due to the fact that information provided by Jews about the fate they suffered during the war has often been viewed with incredulity. What I am referring to in the first place was a perverse consequence of unbelievable radicalism of anti-Jewish policies pursued by the Nazis. Disbelief, writes Jeffrey Hartman, a renowned literary scholar who as a child emigrated from Germany, disbelief touched the survivors themselves. I'm quoting from him. Two phrases stand out in their testimony. I was there and I could not believe my eyes. Everything that happened was so gigantic, so inconceivable, that the witness even seemed like a fabricator to himself, unquote. I can testify to this bafflement with the outsized scale of Holocaust events as reported by witnesses from personal experience. It took me 4 years and a pure lucky coincidence to realize that the testimony of Shmuel Wasserstein, who described the crime in Jedwabne, the subject of my book Neighbors, that's over there, was not an exaggeration, but a pretty faithful description of what had happened. Another reason for doubting information about the unfolding catastrophe of European Jews was a long-lasting memory of an Allied propaganda hoax dating back to the First World War. At the time, tales of German atrocities allegedly committed against the civilian population, especially in Belgium, were grossly exaggerated. Consequently, reports of mass murder coming out of occupied Europe 20 years later were still viewed with caution. When we add to this a generally demeaning stereotype of Jews in Christian cultural tradition, we can appreciate why Jewish sources were a priori treated with deep ambivalence. The French-Israeli historian René Poznański describes, for example, a generalized skepticism of high functionaries of the Foreign Office. As a general principle, she characterizes, using their own words, the state of mind in British government circles, and I quote, "As a general principle, Jews have a tendency to exaggerate the severity of persecution to which they are subjected." Unquote. A weighty point of view when held by those who controlled the most important propaganda vehicle broadcasting into occupied Europe, the BBC. In order to ensure the effectiveness of war propaganda, their concern was not to exaggerate any claims, and especially those pertaining to the persecution of Jews. The latter, in order not to give plausibility to a German argument that the war was being waged by the Allies on behalf and in the interest of Jews. Because, according to Nazi propaganda, Jews were pulling all the strings in London and in America. So now, as we will ground our analysis on personal recollections of Jewish survivors, the question for us to answer is, What can historians do with individual personal testimonies? When we take in hand an eyewitness account of a Holocaust victim, we place it mentally in a familiar context. We read it as a statement from an injured party. There is a victim and a victimizer in a scenario that we can imagine, and we hear in the narrative the victim side of the story, presumably one side of the story. And when there are sides, or if you will, parties to a conflict, then we can expect to hear from one party only partial truth. It takes a moment to realize that the vocabulary we employ, victim, testimony, or witness, puts a deceptive frame on our thinking. The semantic heredity of such concepts leads us astray because there is no advocacy in the narratives of Holocaust victims. I know that we should not naively accept an author's stated intentions as the one and only guide to the reading of a text, but they should not be discarded out of hand either. We must remember, therefore, that Jewish testimonies about the Shoah have been deliberately written in order to provide an exact account of the catastrophe. This is evidenced in numerous memoirs and journals kept by Jews at the time. Since it appeared impossible to save the mass of Jewish people methodically annihilated in the Nazi organized killing process, a sense of obligation grew among the Jewish record keepers, and they say so explicitly and repeatedly, to at least preserve the evidence of the very process of destruction. Thus revealed, future readers cannot dismiss authors' intentions lightly. Clearly, their aim was to produce an account of what happened, not to embellish the story. If anything, the record keeper's difficulty was the reverse. The reality surrounding them was such an exaggeration of everything people were accustomed to in the course of everyday life that their concern could only be whether posterity would be capable of believing in what had really happened, the record, as it were. In virtually all Holocaust-era diaries, detailed, unique, specific to the place, and reflecting the vagaries of each author's individual destiny, one finds a common theme, a recurring line. Whatever we may have foreseen and written about many times, I'm quoting now by way of example from Hermann Krug's entry of October 28, 1942 from his diaries, and I quote, "It is all hardly a fraction of the actual situation," unquote. One cannot grapple with the surrounding reality, all diaries seem to be saying. It cannot be communicated fully. Holocaust memoirists labored against enormous odds, most strikingly against their own incredulity at what was happening around them. Their predicament was bewildering. Nobody will believe us if we say it how it was, and yet we can at best only tell a fraction of what has actually happened. Did they have any need or inducement to exaggerate or embellish their narratives? I think not. Rather, their one and only ultimate satisfaction, a hopeless task we know, could come from being able to say to themselves as readers of what they had left us, yes, that's exactly what happened. Personal testimonies may have finally entered the mainstream of Holocaust historiography with the most recent grand synthesis, Scholl Friedlander's The Years of Extermination, published in 2007, where the author draws on such material abundantly. Christopher Browning has published in 2010 a similarly grounded study of a forced labor camp in Starachowice, as did Yehuda Bauer in his Death of a Shtetl, and now Omer Bardov in his book that will be published this year on communal genocide in Buchach. with giants in the field drawing freely on personal testimonies of Holocaust victims and survivors, historiographical standards are shifting. But so far, it has been a struggle to fend off criticisms which easily dismiss writing on the basis of personal documents as not properly grounded and providing merely anecdotal evidence. In the meantime, for an entire spectrum of interesting subjects, the fate of Jews hiding on the so-called Aryan side, or resistance in provincial ghettos, for example, almost no other empirical evidence is available. The task before us then is to figure out how to obtain a reliable understanding of a general phenomenon, in my case, killings and plunder of Polish Jews by their fellow citizens, on the basis of personal statements, which by their very nature offer only episodic and discrete information. Ever since the story of the murder in Jedwabne was debated in Poland about 20 years ago, historians of the Holocaust began to study court cases prosecuted after the war on the basis of the August 31st, 1944 decree of the Provisional Polish Government. It is customary to refer to them now in a shorthand because of the date when the law was put in place as the August cases. Some 2 decades after the war, all the August cases from court districts around the country were conveniently assembled in one archival collection. Today, they are in the holdings of the Institute of National Memory. I shall draw here on a very useful contribution of 2 historians who examined all the August cases in the Kielce voivodeship, that's a territorial district in Poland, containing evidence about murders of Jews by the Poles in the countryside of this region. Altogether, about 250 people were brought to justice there for the alleged involvement in the murder of several hundred Jews. The authors, Alina Skibińska and Jakub Petelewicz, Polish historians, complemented their knowledge acquired from archival readings with interviews conducted in the area. We need to focus now on what is at stake here and what kind of question we are bringing to the evidence at our disposal. Essentially, we want to adjudicate between 2 interpretations of the phenomenon of murder and plunder of Jews by their fellow Polish citizens during the war. One interpretation would simply claim that stuff happens. People get killed during the war, there was a lot of violence all around, and so it got privatized at times, banditry was rampant, people lost their moral bearings, there is always scum in a society, and anyway, one should not generalize on the basis of isolated cases. In short, that this was deviant behavior. Or else, it was not. And in order to find out, I suggest that we must read the content of the cases to learn what actually happened and make sense of it. I'm now going to quote extensively from the above-mentioned article describing numerous murders of Jews hiding in the Kielce countryside. I spliced together fragments of text scattered over several pages in a continuous narrative. So I'm beginning a quote, which is fairly lengthy, from the article of these 2 Polish historians. Quote, "Killings by shooting with an axe or using a wooden pole were accompanied by acts of physical and psychological cruelty towards Jews who had been caught. Women were raped, people were beaten, pushed around, cursed at, and verbally humiliated. The accused, in other words, the alleged perpetrators of crimes against the Jews, were peasants, Polish so-called dark blue policemen from outposts closest to the site of murder, members of various guerrilla organizations who frequently were the very peasants living during the day in their villages rather than staying in forest detachments. In very many cases, the accused held some position or function in the local officialdom. Village heads, deputy village heads, district heads, employees of district office, members and commanders of local fire brigades, members of village guard. They were, without exception of Roman Catholic denomination, grown-up men, in general, without a prior criminal record. They had stable family life, wives and children. Some of them were members of the Communist Party or worked in the People's Militia, the police force, after the war. These are all trials held after the war, so there are snippets of their biographies after the war that we already know. By virtue of their function, at least a part of them belonged to the local elite in the countryside. Women had often witnessed and observed what had happened. They belonged to passive crowds which carried out the killings with the hands of a few of their most active participants. One could even venture a proposition, based on depositions from witnesses and the accused, that there were many active participants and observers in almost each of these crimes. As far as murders perpetrated in villages, we can even speak about an aggressive criminal crowd where a few people play an initiating and leading role, while everybody else, by witnessing their crime, provides at the same time a background and a moral alibi for the crime committed. I'm continuing to quote. In a certain sense, the entire village takes part in it, with a different degree of involvement or witnessing, and after the war, the entire village keeps in its collective unconscious and memory events which then took place with its participation. This anonymous crowd constitutes an extremely important element for the analysis of this phenomenon. Its presence allows responsibility for the crimes committed to be diffused, and in a certain sense, silently gives permission to do what had been done to the Jews. In numerous files, we read detailed descriptions of the crimes, during which victims and perpetrators talked to each other. Jews defended themselves, begged and appealed to the conscience and pity of the killers. After this man was killed, this little boy stood up and said to everybody present, "Poles, spare my life. I am not guilty of anything. It is my misfortune that I am a Jew." They tried to bribe the perpetrators with what they still had and thus save their lives. We were playing cards when somebody dropped in and said that the Jew had been caught. I went outdoors. In front of the house stood a group of people, and Moshek begged to be let go. He was with his little son, and they cried. This little Jew said, "Give them boots, Daddy, maybe they'll let us go." Crimes were perpetrated against individuals known, often by name, against neighbors, against local folks. I'm still quoting. A special category of perpetrators were the functionaries of the Polish Dark Blue Police, in their majority pre-war employees of the state police. Policemen implicated in crimes against the Jews were heads of families, typically with several children at home. Their material status was usually rather good. In their actions against the Jewish population, one can notice a large segment of freedom and independence from superior German authority. In the case at hand, there was not a single instance in which apprehended Jews were escorted back to a ghetto or to a police station, which would also mean death for them. They are usually killed right away or in a neighboring forest, and local peasants are ordered to bury the corpses. The direct motive to commit the majority of murders and denunciations of Jews hiding in the countryside was the desire to plunder them, to take over their belongings, which were imagined to be considerable. This was a pernicious consequence of a stereotype about Jewish wealth. Peasants imagined that by killing these people, they will get hold of their riches. One should suppose that in a psychological sense, the fact that hiding Jews were paying for shelter and food, and often very high prices by local standards, reinforced the belief that they have lots of money which can be taken from them with impunity. Indirectly, the same motive underlay murders of Jews who no longer could pay off those giving them shelter. People were getting rid of them, just as they were getting rid of Jews who had witnessed crimes committed earlier. In over a dozen closely researched cases, there is mention of characteristics and telling facts which accompanied the crime. After having finished, peasants gathered in the apartment of one of the participants to drink vodka, as if to celebrate with a meal their joint deed, to divide the spoils, and probably also to decompress. Unquote. I'm closing this very long quote. The above summary of many cases from the Kielce Voivodeship does not represent my reading of the evidence from the files of August cases tried in the Kielce District Court. It has been provided by two young Polish historians. It offers a composite image, and all the enumerated elements certainly could not be found in every episode they took under scrutiny. But it is nevertheless abundantly clear that any concept of deviance would have to be stretched beyond capacity to encompass the kind of behavior that Skibińska and Paterewicz have described. Instead, we can note multiple ways in which killings of Jews by peasants in the Kielce countrysides were socially sanctioned. Regular members of the community took part in them, not miscreants or marginal people easily identifiable in rural society. Indeed, the local elite's participation bestowed upon these crimes a kind of official imprimatur. Killings were carried out openly, often publicly, drawing crowds of onlookers. Direct perpetrators of these crimes, the most active participants, as far as one can tell, remained members of local communities in good standing. As was mentioned earlier, some joined the Communist Party and the People's Militia after the war. In almost every file, there are group affidavits signed by inhabitants of the village where murder took place, vouching for the good and honorable character of the accused. This is proof, Skibińska and Paterewicz observe, and I quote again from them, that the village was in solidarity with the accused and that in the consciousness of its inhabitants there was no need to prosecute or to expiate in any way for the crime. Unquote. In the conclusion of their article, the authors finally draw on interviews they conducted in the region 60 years after the events. They note an almost total lack of interest in the fate of murdered Jews. And that, and I quote them once again, if any emotion could be found in conversations, it was a disapproval directed towards the victims. Unquote. Given the deep religiosity of the peasants, they wonder why obligations vis-à-vis other human beings derived from Christian ethics were never invoked. What renders the study of the Holocaust so frustrating is its facelessness, the scandalous anonymity of victims unrecognized in their individuality at the moment of death, which every society marks with a solemn ritual, even for the lowliest and poorest. If I may paraphrase a well-known saying, to invoke 1 million people gassed at Auschwitz is tantamount to just quoting a number. But such is the nature of the subject and the evidence at our disposal that in writing Holocaust history, references to staggering numbers of victims cannot be avoided. Nonetheless, we yearn to pierce the oblivion to which this relegates individual victims, if only because violent death, which had been inflicted upon them, is by nature an intimate and personal experience. Confined to abstractions, we would not understand what had happened, and our account of the Holocaust would not be truthful. Because, at the risk of saying the obvious, actual people were killed in this man-made calamity, and actual people carried out the killings. And it is at the periphery of the Holocaust that we come across the most abundant evidence personalizing what happened when killings of Jews were carried out by their Christian neighbors. In a study About Eichmann and his men, historian Hans Safrian called his protagonists not bureaucrats, but pathfinders. In fact, this observation applies to all Nazi perpetrators of the Holocaust in positions of authority over the Jews, since there was no ready blueprint, no bureaucratic routine to latch on, and everything was fluid in this enterprise. A felicitous phrase coined by Jan Kershaw to characterize the overall functioning of the Nazi system, that following cues emanating from the top of the hierarchy rather than strict instructions, functionaries of the regime were, as Kershaw put it, working towards the Führer, fits admirably as a description of the mechanism of the final solution. No matter how large or small the domain over which they resided, a work detail, a barrack, a ghetto, or a camp, the men in charge of solving the so-called Jewish question were improvisers. Notwithstanding Raoul Hilberg's painstaking reconstruction of bureaucratic coordination required to mobilize resources of a modern state to kill millions of Jews, very much the key aspect of what had happened, at the core of the process lay improvisation. It is a point that Hilberg explicitly acknowledges in Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah. Of course, bureaucratic capacity as well as the technology of a modern state were necessary to carry out in a timely fashion the mass murder of widely dispersed millions of people, but bureaucratic apparati and bureaucratic routines are devised with specific goals in mind. And to apply them to different tasks requires adaptation. To put it in the simplest terms, trains carrying Jews to death camps, again, so instructively discussed by Hilberg and Shoah, were not operating according to a regular schedule. These were specially chartered trains, and somebody had to request them and steer them all the way through the maze of regular traffic. And so they could have been ordered or not. There could have been more or less of them. They could have been moved faster or slower through regular traffic. And so it goes for virtually every aspect of the killing process. At every stage of the Holocaust, decisions had to be made. It is a phenomenon filled with individual initiatives of the perpetrators, who are not simply cogs in a machine operating according to preordained rules. Far from it. And what this means is that agency in the Shoah, to a degree we perhaps have not adequately recognized when thinking and writing about it, rests with a multitude of concrete individuals. Many people pushed the process along on their own initiatives, and there were ipso facto many choke points where the process could have been slowed down, derailed, even temporarily halted. And this was a significant and viable alternative because from a certain point on, it became clear that the Nazis were going to lose the war. To say, therefore, that nothing could have been done once the Nazi policy of killing all the Jews had been set in motion is incorrect. A lot of people could have done something, or as it were, not done something, with the result that hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives would have been saved. Much of the evidence about killings or denunciations of Jews by peasants in the Polish countryside consists of uncorroborated personal testimony from survivors, their relatives or acquaintances. Typically, it is brief and notes the facts without many details. Much of the time, it is second-hand information. For example, knowledge that had been sought out and acquired after the fact by a concerned family member. Thus, the body of evidence is not systematic in any sense of the word, and it has not been part of any record, purely. But the heart of the argument has to be made not by asking what percentage of Polish peasants were hunting down local Jews. We will never be able to provide reliable statistics on this, but rather by reconstructing how these murders were conducted. And as a number of detailed narratives exhibit concurring characteristics, we can make a leap towards a general understanding of the phenomenon. It is so because society with a common past and shared customs and institutions has a degree of internal coherence. One should view it as analogous to a text or a system rather than a quilt stitched together from randomly assembled pieces. As a result, practices and attitudes engaging fundamental values, those concerning life and death, for example, must be intelligible beyond the confines of any local community. This is why, even in the absence of firm knowledge about the distribution and frequency of peasant murders of Jews, we can still tell whether they were an accepted social practice from close analysis of a discrete number of episodes. Given the character of these murders, that they were open, well-attended, and widely discussed public events, and given identity of people involved, that these were regular folks, including members of local elites, a so-called thick description of localized community events yields knowledge about behavior in peasant society at large. Let me now move to the question of plunder, which, as we already know, is intimately related to the killings of Jews by their neighbors. We must be aware, of course, that we are operating at the very end of a long food chain here. Real, massive plunder took place as a result of state action in Western Europe and Germany proper, where Jews were solidly middle class and had substantial wealth, which had been taken over through a process of Aryanization, forced emigration, outright confiscation, and also deportation and killings. Throughout the 12 years of the Third Reich, writes Scholl Friedlander, and I quote him, looting of Jewish property was of the essence. It was the most easily understood and most widely adhered to aspect of the anti-Jewish campaign, rationalized, if necessary, by the simplest ideological tenets, unquote. The Third Reich benefited most from the plunder of Jewish wealth, but Vichy France, for example, tried to get its cut as well. So this is not a uniquely East European story, though the hands-on aspect of it probably is. Mass killings in the Podlasie region, of which the murder in Jedwabne was but one episode, were accompanied by widespread and thorough plunder of Jewish property. It would be more difficult to name townspeople who did not plunder Jewish houses while their inhabitants were being incinerated in a large barn on the outskirts of Radziłów, an eyewitness to the murders told a journalist 60 years later. French Catholic priest Father Patrick Bleubois, while searching for mass graves of Jews in the Ukrainian countryside and talking to local witnesses, heard from one of his interlocutors, and I quote Bleubois, "One day we woke up in the village and we were all wearing Jews' clothes," unquote. I'm sure the same occurred in numerous localities east of the river Elbe. And things were not much different at the other end of Europe either. When the most ancient Greek Jewish community was deported from Salonika, I quote, "As soon as they were marched away, people rushed into their houses, tore up floorboards, and battered down walls and ceilings, hoping to find hidden valuables. There was a complete breakdown of order," wrote an official at the time, "and the second-hand shops of the city began to fill up with stolen goods," unquote. But again, whether we quote evidence from 3 or from 33 incidents, we are confronted with a discrete number of episodes, and we remain epistemologically on the ground of anecdotal as opposed to systematic evidence. In order to overcome the inherently incomplete character of data, we need to keep asking how things were done in order to get a general understanding of what happened. And we can reach such understanding by analyzing in detail the character of crimes committed, as well as by reading people's minds, so to speak, wherever a record of conversations has been preserved. Let me offer a few examples. In her memoirs, Haya Finkelstein reports how, just as the mass killings were unfolding in her native Radziłów, someone suggested that she turn over whatever she still had, since together with her family she would certainly be killed. And it was only right, Haya's interlocutor argued, without malice, for the good people who knew the Finkelsteins to get their possessions, or else the killers would be rewarded. To a Jewish man trying to find a hiding place with a peasant acquaintance near Vengrove, the latter's son-in-law said matter-of-factly, "Since you are going to die anyway, why should someone else get your boots? Why not give them to me so I will remember you?" Unquote. Miriam Rosenkrantz had a moment of déjà vu during the program in Kielce, I'm quoting her, when the horror of the ghetto came back to me, and this scene when I worked with sorting down fellas, and we were about to go back to the ghetto, and they were saying that that's the end, that they were deporting us for sure. And then this Polish woman acquaintance looked at my feet, and the following exchange took place. "Really, you could leave me your boots, missy." "But Mrs. Joseph, I'm still alive." "Well, I wasn't saying anything, only that those are nice boots," replied Mrs. Joseph. What we are eavesdropping on by listening to these exchanges are truly out of the ordinary ideas. These snippets of conversations are built on an inversion of important principles regulating people's lives in common. The message addressed to a Jewish interlocutor with the expectation of a voluntary surrender of property to a Polish person is embedded in recast understanding of private property rights, as well as the norm of goodwill binding people who live in close proximity to one another. Until these conversations took place, we could safely assume that local people viewed the right to property, to private property, as inviolable. The only occasion when they felt it might be suspended, in other words, when claims could be made legitimately to surrender what people rightfully owned for the sake of others, would be to relieve extreme hardship which befell on some other members of the community. In case of fire, or flood, or an earthquake, an act of goodwill sustaining reciprocity for times when extreme hardship would in turn fall on themselves. What does it mean that three different people on three different occasions, and one could of course quote many more similar exchanges as they caught the attention of Jewish interlocutors and were recorded, express exactly the same very unusual thought about matters of fundamental importance in the life of a community concerning private property? I find it implausible that such convergence of ideas, inverting the meaning of private property and neighborly obligation, as far as the Jews were concerned, was purely coincidental. Again, I am alluding here to the assumption that practices and important beliefs in society are interconnected and must be congruent. In other words, what is accepted as a matter of fact in one of its segments could not be directly negated in another, or else people would be experiencing cognitive dissonance. Thus, to my mind, this anecdotal evidence, and it would remain anecdotal even if we quoted 10 or 15 such episodes, is an indication of a shift in shared norms concerning acceptable behavior towards the Jews. In the eyes of their Polish neighbors, Jews ceased to be human beings and were perceived instead, to use the expression coined by Emanuel Ringelblum, a witness to these events and a historian, as he put it, deceased on holidays, unquote. It may seem that I am grasping at straws here, but it is important to develop ways of argumentation portraying the plunder of Jews for what it was, namely a social practice, rather than a criminal, so to speak, or a deviant behavior of some rogue individuals. That plunder was widespread and sanctioned by norms is revealed precisely by the form of reference to it captured in language. We find an echo of this shift in normative expectations, not only among individuals speaking about interpersonal relations, but in institutional evaluations concerning relationships between groups, such as an early report of the underground sent to the London government in exile, indicating that Jews are non-responsive to Polish Catholic fellow citizens' approaches to take their goods, even though it is clear that otherwise everything will only end up in German hands. Evidently, by not consenting to be despoiled by their neighbors, Jews were somehow favoring Germans over Poles. And so the stakes are rising. A recalcitrant Jew, unwilling to surrender his or her boots to a Polish acquaintance, is not only unfriendly, but implicitly also unpatriotic. Conversely, when retail Jewish commercial property and real estate was ordered by German decrees into Aryan trusteeship, an opportunity for enrichment which was taken up with eagerness by Polish lawyers, for example, this was also defended by suggestions that members of the corporation were rescuing this wealth from German hands. And since the practice of Aryanization was continent-wide, Poland, as we shall see, was not the only place where similar arguments had been advanced. Where do we go from here? Let me conclude this discussion of plunder with a few snippets of conversation followed by views articulated in important underground memoranda. A certain Józef Górski, a well-to-do landowner from central Poland, writes the following about the Holocaust in his landmarks, and I'm quoting him now. As a Christian, I could not feel compassion, double negative in the original, with my fellow human beings. But as a Pole, I looked at what was happening differently. I considered Jews to be an internal enemy. So I could not help feeling glad that we are getting rid of this enemy and, what's more, not with our own hands, but thanks to the deeds of another external enemy. I could not hide satisfaction when I rode through our little towns and saw that there were no more Jews. Asked by Turm, a local German official with whom he was on this occasion, do Poles perceive being liberated from the Jews as a blessing? I replied, gewiss, of course, being sure that I am expressing the opinion of the overwhelming majority of my fellow nationals, unquote. And Górski was reading the minds of his fellow nationals correctly. Some variation of a detail will have to put up a monument to Hitler for having gotten rid of the Jews, was overheard in private conversations all over Poland. We have testimony to this effect not only from Jews who were successfully passing as Aryans and later recounted what they saw and heard in their wartime milieus, but from numerous Polish witnesses as well. Given such a widespread consensus of opinion, it is no wonder that with the war's end approaching, highly placed functionaries of the Polish underground state advised the government in exile in London about a looming, what else? Jewish problem. The official position of the government had been that all changes resulting from decisions taken by occupiers with respect to matters involving geographical boundaries, citizenship rights and status, property confiscations, all purported legal changes, in other words, were null and void. But London, where the Polish government in exile resided, was warned repeatedly from the home country that the matter was not as simple as it may have seemed. Return to the status quo ante and resumption by Jews of their economic role from before the war was an impossibility, reported Roman Knoll, the head of the Foreign Affairs Commission in the apparatus of the government delegate. This was under the underground civilian administration in occupied Poland. There was a very robust underground anti-Nazi movement. The non-Polish population had taken over Jewish positions in the social structure, he wrote in 1948, and this change is final and permanent in character. And I'm quoting him verbatim. Should Jews attempt to return en masse, rumors and exaggerated estimates circulated about the numbers of Jews who had managed to escape into the Soviet interior and were expected to return to Poland after the war. people would not perceive this as a restoration, but as an invasion, which they would resist even by physical means, unquote. In July 1945, another distinguished politician of the London-affiliated underground, Jerzy Braun, conveyed his observations about the growing anti-Semitism in Poland, and I'm quoting. "Today, there is no place for a Jew in small towns and villages. During the past 6 years, finally, emphasis in original, a Polish third estate has emerged, which did not exist before. It completely took over trade, supplies, mediation, and local crafts in the provinces. Those young peasant sons and former urban proletarians who once worked for the Jews are determined, persistent, greedy, deprived of all moral scruples in trade, and superior to Jews in courage, initiative, and flexibility. Those masses will not relinquish what they have conquered. There is no force which could remove them. It was understandable that Jews who survived the onslaught but could not return to their hometowns leave ruined and broken, telling the rest of the world that Poles are anti-Semites. But what they take for anti-Semitism, Braun concludes, is only an economic law which cannot be helped, unquote. And truth be told, the majority of Polish peasants came into possession of Jewish property because Jews all over Europe, and ipso facto in Poland, had been killed by the Germans. Some peasants helped their luck, and most liked what happened. But their involvement in these crimes was opportunistic. All that I'm arguing for is recognition that when the opportunity arose, they were not shy to take it. I'd like to turn your attention, please, to the photograph. The photograph that you see on the screen is a familiar image people have seen in countless variations. Peasants at harvest time, after work well done, resting contentedly with their tools behind a pile of crops. Some may have taken a snapshot of this kind on summer vacations with distant relatives at the countryside. Others carry it as a souvenir from a scouting expedition, helping farmers in the backcountry bring in their crops. Every summer, it was regularly splashed across the front pages of newspapers half the world over in communist countries in celebration of yet another bountiful harvest provided by collectivized agriculture, and visitors came upon it, its most more or less artistically refined renditions in art galleries and museums. Yet, despite belonging to a bucolic genre, people at ease, surrounded by nature, talking to one another, in a moment they will probably burst into singing, this particular photograph, and not just because it is fuzzy, is disquieting. If there were palms protruding from behind the assembled group, rather than coniferous trees, one could speculate that it was taken in a desert. Something feels off-kilter with the landscape, which cannot be pegged easily to a geographical location. The image strikes the viewer as familiar and strange at the same time. And when one finally notices the crop scattered in front of the group, skulls and bones, no less, the mystery deepens. Where are we? Who are the people in the photograph? And what are they doing? We are in the middle of Europe, just after World War II has ended, that is, in the middle of the 20th century. And we see in the photograph a bunch of peasants standing atop a mountain of ashes. These are human ashes of more than 800,000 Jews, gassed and cremated in the Treblinka extermination camp between July 1942 and October 1943. The Europeans captured in the photograph have been digging through the remains of Holocaust victims, hoping to find gold and precious stones that Nazi executioners may have overlooked despite carefully checking the body cavities of murdered Jews. One of the earliest mentions of this phenomenon, together with a few photographs of Treblinka's eerie landscape, came from two fellows who visited the site of the Treblinka extermination camp on September 12, 1945. The entire area, they reported, was scarred with holes, several meters deep, with human bones scattered all around. People sifting through the mounds of human ashes did not bother to answer when asked what they were doing. The area was large, the scale of excavations enormous. Thousands have to have worked to produce this lunar landscape. And while the scale of the Treblinka excavations was unique, the practice of digging up Jewish remains from the sites of mass murder to strip them of valuables was common. But the plunder of Jewish wealth, the main story illuminated in the photograph, was a continent-wide affair. It took place from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Volga River in the east, and was accompanied by the opportunistic behavior of the local population, despite the locals also being subjected to exploitation and terror by Nazi conquerors. In 1943, in anticipation of German defeat, various associations were formed in occupied France to protect the interests of those Frenchmen who had acquired the so-called Aryanized Jewish property. Such associations continued to exist, albeit under new names, after the liberation. They defended their constituencies fiercely against the restitution of Jewish businesses or apartments to their rightful owners. Those who bought Jewish property protected French interests, the association argued. And I'm quoting, by buying property that the Germans threatened to liquidate, the purchasers preserved a precious inheritance for the national economy. Unquote. Thus framed, stripping the Jews of their assets was cast as responsible in patriotic behavior. Little wonder that in April of 1945, hundreds of demonstrators went to the streets of Paris crying, "Death to the Jews," and "France for the French." The few Jews returning to their hometowns after the war, from Salonika to Warsaw and to Paris, were made unwelcome by former neighbors already comfortably ensconced in their old apartments and jobs. The story of the plunder of Jewish assets occasionally reaches large circulation press when Swiss banks are challenged to produce lists of dormant accounts, or national museums are forced to return stolen Jewish paintings acquired through bona fide art dealers. However, its significance is not in being a momentary focus of journalistic zeal, but the very fabric of what Scholl Friedlander identifies as the broad consent to the Nazi-organized Holocaust by institutions and people in occupied Europe. And I'm quoting now from Friedlander. Not one social group, not one religious community, not one scholarly institution or professional association in Germany and throughout Europe declared its solidarity with the Jews. Some of the Christian churches declared that converted Jews were part of the flock up to a point. To the contrary, many social constituencies, many power groups were directly involved in the expropriation of the Jews and eager, be it out of greed, for their wholesale disappearance. Thus, and this last sentence is emphasized in Nazi's book by the author, Nazi and related anti-Jewish policies could unfold to their most extreme levels without the interference of any major countervailing interests. Unquote. Many across the European continent have benefited from the Nazi policies, stripping Jews of civic and property rights and eliminating them from public life, or rather, as it soon transpired, from stripping the Jews of life altogether. A question and answer to frame this 20th century European cover story, so dramatically illustrated with the picture on the screen here, could run like this. What does a Swiss banker and a Polish peasant have in common? And the answer to this question, only a slight exaggeration, would be a golden tooth extracted from the jaws of a Jewish corpse. Thank you very much.
take some questions, and then we'll have a book signing in the back of the room. So, does anybody have questions for Dr. Gross?
Dr. Gross, I read your book, Neighbors, about 4 or 5 years ago in a graduate class I had, and I don't want to say I enjoyed it, but it was a very good work. It was very informative. One thing that really stuck out to me was a case you mentioned where the slaughter of the Jews in Guadalajara was so great that the Nazis who had come in were locking some of them up in a jail cell to protect them from the Polish citizens. That was extremely shocking, that role reversal. Can you tell me if that was an isolated incident or if that had happened in other communities throughout Poland or Europe in general?
You know, I mean, killings of Jews, Holocaust in general, was a mess. As I said, it's just a lot of things were going on in a kind of a spontaneous, unthought through first manner. And I mean, there were episodes which are recorded and recounted of Germans saving Jews and protecting Jews on various occasions. I mean, you may have seen, for example, Schindler's List, a very wonderful film that had been done. This is a real story that has been recounted, and there were episodes in which, in moments of violence, some German might have shielded a Jew, but the fundamental weight and burden of responsibility, of course, is with the Germans and with Nazi policies set in practice during occupation of Europe. They found a lot of helpers, but Jews lived throughout Europe, throughout in Eastern Europe, in Poland, thousands of years. I mean, hundreds of years, I say, 1,000 years. And there were episodic, usually associated with either wars or social upheavals, events of deathly assaults on Jews. But on the whole, this was a livable environment in which Jewish society and Jewish culture thrived. So that mass murder that takes place, this was something that had been set in motion by Nazi policy.
Two things that struck me. First, the parallel to lynching in the U.S. South. The agricultural communities, prominent people involved, it's a communal event. Maybe not the purpose aren't being. The people and victims are probably known in most cases.
Yeah.
And, does that signal to a kind of broader phenomenon, this kind of transcultural, and when it comes to kind of this kind of practice of plundering and killing? I mean, have you found that useful?
Yeah.
What do you see here?
You know, one fundamental difference between Holocaust and these episodes during the Holocaust, genocide, let's say, and lynchings, even though there is a lot of parallels one might draw. The intent of a lynching is not to kill all the blacks that are available, that are locally available. It's rather to sort of police the blacks, to tell them, you better behave or else this will happen. These acts were not meant as social control episodes over Jewish population to make it docile and obedient. So in that sense, genocide has a completely different dynamics and purpose. But these were communal acts of shared and kind of festive, very often, events. And in that sense, of course, there is a parallel. I find the sort of mechanism I haven't studied this. It's a very surface knowledge that I have of episodes of genocide in Rwanda, for example, or in the Balkans, where also communities that lived together for an extensive period of time were incited to violence by very explosive rhetoric that was put through by politicians, and then acts that followed. The mechanics is very similar in a way. These are sort of intimate people who know each other, kill each other, and robbery takes place. It's pillage. It's typically accompanied with it. And I would even say more, that when genocides take place, it's very difficult to conceive of an effective genocidal practice without the participation of local people, because outsiders cannot identify all members of the target community. There has to be inside help. Yeah. Yes.
What is your reaction to what is happening in Poland today?
The same as yours. I think. Yeah. This is a crazy government, and they put, I mean, this is the least harmful public policy that they have implemented for last 2 years. They were destroying the framework of democratic institutions very deliberately, and just spoiling a lot of things. And that's part of it. I don't want to poo-poo it, so to speak. It's a very serious matter, because for the first time in 50 years, one sees a ruling group, a regime, a government, draw anti-Semitic energy, anti-Semitic sentiments into political life as a means to shore up and gather support of right-wing. But let me say simply that it's terrible, of course. But let me put a different spin on this, and which partly you wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't come to your minds. I don't know to what extent you're interested in what goes day by day in Poland. But if you follow this, you would see that there is a tremendous pushback in Poland against it. The opposition politicians speaking up against it, journalists, intellectuals in main weeklies that are against the regime. This issue is just very prominently displayed, and arguments being made, how horrible it is to decree false things about the past. So the whole story there is a powerful and with large viewership, a private television channel, which constantly in its political reporting and news, this has been featured every day since that law has been passed. A very critical response to it. And so in a strange way, this may have the effect of bringing the issue up and getting people who are not professionally interested in it, but have just open minds to recognize that Polish complicity in persecution of Jews during the war was much more extensive than they knew themselves, and that certainly that the regime is willing to acknowledge. So that's a complicated answer to a simple question, to which the answer also can be very simple. Yeah.
A question looking maybe a little bit beyond the Polish context too, about just the criminalizing of the truth. We see that actually in the case of genocide in Turkey as well.
Yes,
Turkey has, of course, criminalized even mentioning the Armenian genocide. Yes. What is it about genocide, as an historian, do you think, that leads later generations to criminalize the truth?
What is it? Well, these are events in which large, either institutions or large groups of people have to be involved. I mean, genocide, the scale, by definition, has to be big, and so it implicates in the minds of nationalists, narrow-minded nationalists. It implicates a good name, if you will, of a community, as if one could run away from the truth, and as if it was not the other way around. I mean, a good name of community would be built precisely on its ability to recognize that such crimes have been committed and to air them fully. There was this fairly good period in the last 25 years when, you know, the paradox of the situation in Poland is that there is a fantastic historiography of the Holocaust written by Polish historians. For the last 20 years, Polish historians have pursued the matter and the subject of Polish complicity in persecution of Jews during the war like no historians in any other country in Europe that have been occupied by the Germans. There is that many, I'm literally speaking, there is one of the main publications there of a unit which is called Center for the Study of on Holocaust of Polish Jews, which is in the Polish Academy of Science, the most important institution, and they publish a yearly, not a weekly, not a monthly, not a yearly, so it's thick. And we were celebrating recently, it was 10th anniversary, but now it's 14. And if you put 10 volumes, or 14 volumes, one on top of the other, just lying flat, this is the height of a human being, you know. And this is not all of it that has been, and half of it is full with all kinds of specific analysis of cases and episodes, precisely in which local population had been involved. Add to it a number of monographs that have been written. There is, you've seen, some of you have been to a film yesterday, Aftermath. So there is artistic production which means a kind of a communication and message that has much broader audience than scholarly publications do, that works with this issue of Polish complicity and Polish crimes on their Jewish fellow citizens. So, strangely enough, you know, if you think about this 1/3 of the population, the elite, whatever, those who want to read and who are interested, they are as enlightened as anywhere. At the same time, there have been this just nationalistic, xenophobic, terrible, awful backlash that came to power. Yeah.
I think that we will, thank you, and we're going to now, let's move on to the books and we can see.